Delegates of SIEF 2021, it is our pleasure and honour to introduce the keynote for today, Dr. Susan Keitumetse. I'm Susie Thomas. I work at the University of Helsinki as Associate Professor of Cultural Heritage Studies, and I'm interested in how different groups and communities perceive, understand, and use heritage. I'm especially interested in the activities of so-called treasure hunters, themselves often rule breakers and non-professional archaeology enthusiasts. I'm joined in this session today by Dr. Pia Olsen, who I hand over now to so she can introduce herself.
Hello, nice to meet you all. I'm Pia Olsen and Susie's colleague from the University of Helsinki, and my background is in European ethnology. And my focus in cultural heritage questions is in questions of urban heritage, but also on documentation and archiving cultural heritage. Happy to be here, and I will be helping with the Q&A part of this session.
Thank you, Pia. And now about our keynote for today. I first came to know Susan a few years ago when I was still co-editor of the Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage. She submitted a paper to us with her student Michelle Pampiri titled Community Cultural Identity in Nature Tourism Gateway Areas, Mourne Village, Okavango Delta, World Heritage Site, Botswana. The paper itself, dealing with ethnographic research that uncovered community cultural values in Mourne Village and showed how these might complement rather than contradict the prevailing nature tourism of the region, was and remains a fascinating and important read. More striking to me, though, was Susan's obvious warmth and willingness to enter into dialogue, apparent even over email correspondence. My journal co-editor, Dr. Carol McDavid, knew Susan from their doctoral student days at the University of Cambridge, and with her additional enthusiasm, it was not long before we'd invited Susan to our editorial board. I finally got to meet Susan in June 2017, when we were able, in that time before Corona, to invite her in person to be a keynote at a working conference called Development and Best Practices of Archaeological Heritage Management as a Course, which took place at the Museum Centre Vapriiki in Tampere. We are only sorry, as has been said so many times already this week, not to be welcoming her and all of you to Finland in person once again. Susan Keitumetse is UNESCO Chairholder in African Heritage Studies and Sustainable Development and a research scholar in cultural heritage and tourism at the University of Botswana. She is the author of African Cultural Heritage Conservation and Management, Theory and Practice from Southern Africa, and is also a lead editor of the recent volume, Sustainability in Developing Countries, Case Studies from Botswana's Journey Towards Sustainable Development. Dr. Keitumetse has published numerous papers in addition to this in many international books and edited volumes and journals. Her current research work is on the relevance of cultural heritage and enhancing environmental conservation of African landscapes in a way that will lead to the achievement of sustainable development goals. One such project is identifying cultural indicators of protected nature spaces and overlaying them as a way to enhance environmental conservation. Her keynote today is entitled Exploring Environment Community Connections in Africa's Nature Reserves, Overlaying Community Cultural Values to Enhance Conservation. Esteemed colleague, Dr. Susan Keitumetse, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for your attention. My name is Susan Keitumetse from the University of Botswana. I work as a research scholar in cultural heritage, but I'm also a UNESCO chairholder. Our UNESCO chair is titled African Heritage Studies and Sustainable Development. I am very much honored to be invited today for this talk in this conference of breaking the rules, power, participation, and transgression, because it's a theme that is very relevant in terms of us, especially in conservation, that while we were locked down, how can we post-lockdown see to it that we sharpen our conservation approaches by breaking the rules, of course, and renewing our thinking as well as approaches towards conservation of landscapes. I'm going to be talking mostly in the context of African landscapes, because that is where my experience is actually vested. I have done a lot of work. I have 15 years plus working on African landscapes, especially in Southern Africa. mainly on researching cultural heritage and its link to sustainable development, the one international policy that everyone is talking about, that we are now working towards 2030. And in this presentation, I hope to touch on these conservation issues in Africa, but not just talk about Africa, but they're going to have thinking capabilities for other landscapes. And also as we share experiences, not only from Africa, but also from Europe. I've been listening to other presentations. I realized that, we need to exchange notes more. And this presentation is meant to show that as well as share experiences. In terms of African conservation issues, there are various issues, as I put on the screen, that makes it very, very difficult maybe for participation of, in particular, local communities in conservation of landscapes. That also makes it difficult for cultural heritage in particular to come across in some of the most pristine natural resources environments in Africa. And part of my research has been invested in that, to show that we are missing a very important link by neglecting cultural aspects, which are people aspects of conservation. And we miss this because we are not breaking the rules enough in disciplinary approaches. We are excluding, because of protected area models, that some of them run from the colonial period, have automatically excluded locals from their landscapes even, but not only from their landscape, from conceptualizing the use of their landscape for modern times of economy, for modern times of emotional connection, for modern times of just maybe heritage for heritage's sake. We also be able to talk about how international conventions, though well-meaning, can at times make it difficult to bring about the cultural aspects of a protected World Heritage Site. In this case, the UNESCO sites. Government approaches of conservation are discussed, also the nature-nurture approach that we've been talking about for a very long time. It's still taking place in African landscape conservation. It's making it difficult for local communities, for cultural aspects in particular, to come out. And this has consequences for conservation in general. And of course, the economics of landscape management, represented by tourism, of course. So we need to be looking at these indicators and say, how can we break the rules of disciplinary, of protected area model, of nature-nurture, to come up with a conservation model where local identities are acknowledged and incorporated, and of course, where they can be able to enhance African culture, African landscapes for an enhanced sustainable development of those. In this next slide, I am sharing that my experience that I mentioned has shown me that conservation can only be sustainable if it involves the custodian of the landscape. Because where we don't, we run the risk of seeing people now going against our very well-planned international models, our very well-planned academic models, because at the end of the day, they're the only ones, they're the ones that are occupying the landscapes. We come during term time, or if you're government, you come during a trip to the areas, but they leave those areas every day. It's only fair that we see them as very important partners. Here is myself in one of the meetings where I work with communities to try and find out what we can bring out as part of their heritage of mainly protected areas. So how is overlaying community values breaking the rules? It is breaking the rules because right now it's actually not considered as important. It's just a passive way in conservation. We see a lot of literature that talk about community. Of course, we publish about that. But when it comes to implementation, really, there isn't much practicality of what is being advocated for on paper. But when you come to nature reserves, you find that whatever management plans that are put in place are actually being actualized in practice. So it is going to be breaking the rules because we want to make this practice rather than just theory. And by breaking those rules, we will be giving power to the vulnerable, who are the local communities. They're vulnerable because they're disconnected from their heritage and that by consequence disconnected to their emotional well-being. They need to be reconnected with some landscapes that are viewed now as completely nature landscapes. And if you bring people in, or if you advocate even for bringing people in, you are seen as maybe being too political, because now people have been moved from the landscapes for a long time, like national parks and game reserves, some of them in Botswana for indigenous communities. The indigenous communities are now saying we want to go back. This model was not what we envisioned. So it is breaking the rules. And just talking about the emotional aspects of belonging to a landscape is not common in a more like a macho landscapes of conservation. We know that especially when it comes to economic gain from tourism, in the Okavango Delta, especially where I work, it's becoming so much access can be done by our male colleagues because it is a dangerous landscape for females. So this landscape is also maturing that we will be breaking the rules of access because we want access for everybody, not just for hunting purposes of male members of the community who then go with the King of Spain when they visit the Okavango Delta. So these are the things we talk about, and of course it's breaking the rule. And it's also breaking the rules because I am talking in my work about including the excluded aspects of international, not conversation there, but international, what do we call it? Conventions, sorry. Yes. We have aspects of international conventions that are neglected, especially when you look at the development of international conventions at UNESCO level. There's a lot of disconnect even at that level that then affect, or rather, that then motivates and nurture disconnection at the local level. Because in Africa, UN is very well regarded. It is not taken as something light. When an international convention comes from UNESCO, like the UNESCO 1972 World Heritage Convention, here it's highly regarded and implemented with all its might. The ICH Convention, the 2003 Convention from UNESCO, which deals with the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage, is often neglected in protected areas. And we need to break the rules by asking for its overlay, because for Africa, really, it is a convention that brings out the intangible aspects. And those are the main components of African heritage, more than just the tangible aspects, which we understand have been duly supported by the 1972 Convention for a very long time. But it's also breaking the rules because we'll be considered the forgotten, especially when you come to national parks and game reserves in Botswana, where it's a high-end tourism. We are talking the kind of tourism of Prince Harry. We know it's famously known now that Prince Harry actually he proposed to Meghan in the Okavango Delta. We have visitors such as Richard Branson. We have visitors such as the King of Spain, who had a scandal here. Just to show you why we say it's high end, because of its high end nature and because of the nature tourism protected area. It's very, very difficult access to it because it's a pristine but rather difficult landscape to access. You find that people without money, the resources to get into the Delta are excluded, even though they may have identities that they want to revisit. But because now it's a protected area, it is even more no longer the issue of access through very expensive equipment like aeroplanes, but rather that now it's a protected area, you can't just go back. So it is breaking the rules, because we are talking about how these models that have seen African landscapes make a lot of revenue from them have actually come at a cost to local community, cultural affiliation to that land. As I mentioned, how the disciplinary methodologies are compliant in making it difficult for communities to access their landscapes. I am going to be talking here, just as an example, about archaeology. Why archaeology? Because in Africa, especially in Botswana, let me talk about Botswana. Majority of people who are now doing cultural heritage in the country were trained in the UK, were also not only trained in the UK, but were trained as archaeologists. So they have been trained that heritage, especially cultural heritage, conservation, is the artifacts of archaeology, is the monuments as we know it from the 1972 World Heritage Convention. But we also know from Africa that archaeology, by its methodological approach, until maybe the times of Ian Hodder, when they started talking about alternative approaches to archaeology, is actually distant from the locals. It's a human discipline that is viewed mostly as scientific. So we have a lot of practitioners of archaeology in my book that I call, they are caught up in the excavation pit of archaeology rather than what that excavation pit actually means for a local person and how it can be connected to a local person. So a lot of practitioners in archaeology have been distant from engaging the local community for a very long time. Hence why I give example with the archaeology. But when you get also to practitioners, maybe in museums, in African museums also, because of the colonial evolution of these museums, they were looking at the tangibles that are not necessarily prioritized by the local communities themselves. You know, you start talking about dinosaurs and paleontology, and in Africa, just digging a human bone is a taboo. You need to start making people aware why they have to dig such human bones, why it's important to make knowledges from the dead. And as archaeologists, we have failed, because I'm also an archaeologist in doing this for a very long time. And this has disconnected people from understanding their cultural heritage, because this material culture is not for us. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the local communities. But we also, as archaeologists, are very, very particular about hoarding our labs, isn't it? You know, we hoard our labs. It's archaeology labs, and we can't even bring people into these labs. And this is the disconnections that we have to transgress against. The scientific evidence methodology has been touched on by other presenters in this conference. I've been listening to other presenters talking about how we have to change our methods, but mostly in terms of ethnology, in terms of COVID. But I also say for a very long time, the scientific evidence of archaeology as a science, archaeology as a discipline that has seen the development of heritage in most of, at least my country's departments, has made it difficult for the local cultural values to be considered as important, or even the way those communities actually interpret that material culture that shouldn't have gone to the lab at first, but should maybe have started with the local community understanding of what it is, how it's going to be treated, why it's necessary for it to go maybe to a lab in a university versus being interrogated at a community level. So in this case, we need to start breaking the rules of disciplinary approach, especially archaeological disciplinary approach in Africa. I know that there have been strides that have been made in Europe and America, especially with the First Peoples heritage, to involve them. But in Africa, we're still far, far off in involving local communities in scientific studies, because we believe that they are maybe for purposes of academic progression, it takes a long time for people to understand. And as academics, we are often under the pressure of publishing or finishing a project that has been awarded through a certain grant that you have to impress. But we have to bring nonetheless these things out and say, we need to start breaking the rules of these approaches and maybe find projects that assist us to break these rules so that local cultural values and the people that harbor them are taken on board in earnest. Of course, we have this topic that has always been talked about of museums keeping people's heritages in their basements. Some of them, like I said, if they were brought out and maybe interrogated within the cultural areas, could shed more light about people's identities and even assist in the understanding of the new developments as they are innovation in the present. But we are waiting for that particular researcher to find time and assess that material culture and write something in an international journal about it. And the communities are clueless. And this is the reality of African heritage practice at disciplinary level that needs to be broken up. And because of our disciplinary distancing, we find that when we get to landscapes like this is a floor plan of an archaeological structure, possibly a house, but the modern communities have made chairs like this, benches like this for religious purposes, activities that are religious, of religious purpose. Of course, as disciplinary based professionals in universities, when we get there, we see this as vandalism. But I think it's maybe we need to look at it as cultural imprint rather than as site vandalism, and say to ourselves, one way to break this rule of maybe saying, oh, they're vandalizing our archaeological site, we could say, had we made them know in advance how important this is, they would have helped us to have an approach that a community disciplinary approach that wouldn't vandalize the site, that wouldn't move the stones and make it difficult for us to interpret the extent of its interpretation, the scientific interpretation that is, because our contemporary communities have already made their imprint of what is interpretation of the landscape to them. We shouldn't also look at that as a problem. It's another way of studying how the archaeological areas are now being utilized. Sorry about that. So the modern imprint on site will continue to become archaeological science vandalism because we have disconnected the knowledge of what archaeology is doing from the locals. And this is one of the things we have to start reflecting on. It's not only archaeology, it's also anthropological approaches. I've had colleagues presenting on this in other fora in this conference. One of the problems that I've also listed at the first slide that I want to now discuss it here in a bit of a long scale is exactly this. International policies such as sustainable development lack strong cultural indicators. As cultural heritage, as folklore practitioners, we have to start looking at how is it that the natural resources have so many indicators to monitor for maybe destruction of forests, destruction of minerals, destruction of soil. But when you go into the sustainable development indicators, you are going to struggle to find indicators for cultural heritage. And this is where we get bitten as maybe cultural heritage theorists and practitioners, because we are not at the forefront of international policy like the sustainable development. We are not making a mark there, even though we want change for our disciplines, for our practices. for the people that we work with who are not sitting in the forums of sustainable development committees are counting on us. So one of the challenges that I also give to my students is that we have to start a conservation framework that is conceptualized with cultural heritage in mind, rather than anecdotal mention. And the Sustainable Development Framework is one of those. And we all know how important and how cited and how listened to by government sustainable development is. So these are the challenges that we also need to know as cultural heritage conservationists and practitioners, that we are also nowhere to be seen to be breaking the rules of conservation for the good of our field. International conventions. International conventions, especially here in Africa, have helped a lot in just raising awareness of what is heritage. The Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention of 2003, which looks at the intangible aspects such as folklore, artisans, very, very important convention. But it is now finding that a lot of people already, a lot of government has already listed their sites through the famous 1972 World Heritage Convention, which has made a huge impact of raising awareness of the need to conserve our landscapes, the need for countries to look at transboundary conservation so that resources are not depleted in one country and protected in another. But we find that there is a lot of disconnection in terms of how these international conventions actually transition from international policy to local practice conservation. I am going to be giving examples as we go along, but for here, I want to talk about this in particular, that the international conventions as frameworks of management and identity formation in Africa, it's very, very impactful, because governments take this international convention, especially the 1972 convention, very, very seriously. But it comes with a loophole that, as researchers, some of us, we see that we need to be breaking these loopholes in order to move forward in a more sustainable manner. The World Heritage listing, as an example that I promised, encourages dichotomies. And I'm giving an example of this dichotomy that is not sustainable for local cultural values like this. The Okavango Delta has been listed as a nature site. It means that people's recognition has been left out, because we also know that it is not only a nature site, but rather has cultural components that could have been taken on board. If anything, it could have been listed as a mixed site, but it is nature site. So it's no longer as it used to be, and therefore it becomes very difficult to say that people will use their traditional boats to go into the delta. It becomes difficult to say people will be able to interact with the site the way they used to, because of the core zone delimitation that is needed by the World Heritage model. So we need to be advising these approaches and say, here we need to be breaking these approaches of the core zones, of people not being able to come back to their site, but mainly of putting value on sites such as this, that is limited value of nature, when we know that there are international conventions that can place another value of intangible aspects, the folklore, the folk life, on the landscape, and make management of it to be a holistic approach. Management. Culture of evidence in the Okavango, I was just giving an example of why I am saying that Okavango Delta cannot be listed solely as a nature site by UNESCO, because it has examples like this. most of our elders, they are very well known for basket making. And basket making is not just a process of maybe sitting down like this lady has sat down and doing the basket. Before she sits down, she has to interact with the landscape and gather the resources. She has to find other resources that are not the tree that she uses, like the waters to color and the plants to color the basket. She has to find the water to make that color stick before she starts using the plant that she harvested to use for the basket making. So we are saying that there are lots of aspects of cultural heritage within some of these sites that are listed as nature sites. Nothing else but nature, when we know very well that they should be listed in the World Heritage as mixed sites, because there is a mixture of both the nature and the culture. But this goes back to my disciplinary, problematizing our disciplinary approach as academics in particular, and as practitioners as well. Because had we not maybe looked into just the natural value of the Okavango Delta, had cultural heritage practitioners and academics came forward on time and in full force, UNESCO would have taken this into account. So as much as we blame international conventions for dichotomizing the heritage of a landscape, we also, as disciplinary bearers, have to look into ourselves. I'm an anthropologist. I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm not going to worry about pottery that I found on site. If I do a research, am I calling a pottery maker, even though I might be a folklore researcher who has won a grant? Do we make it possible for all our interventions to include everybody, or if at all, to push national governance policies to include everybody, so that we do not see a situation like the Okavango Delta where only one aspect of heritage is valued through an international convention, rather than all the aspects that are there, including the aspects that are found in the 2003 Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. This, I wanted to show that the Okavango Delta is famous for crop production, traditionally used for. Now that I've actually come across these aspects that are very important, I usually advise policy to do a simultaneous implementation of this convention, so that the whole scope of cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, can be taken care of at the same time by governments and international institutions. Like some of us may know that Africa has very few sites in the World Heritage List. But when you get to the sites in danger in the World Heritage List, Africa tops. I have been doing research on this, and when I talk about international conventions as frameworks of identity for African heritage, some of my analysis is pointing to the disconnect at a political level, where we have our leaders inputting on convention conceptualization. I am saying that the political conceptualization of what is heritage at international convention level may be what is making this anomaly to take place. That is why we find a lot of sites that are very pristine in Africa that are listed in the World Heritage List, but they are also the most endangered. They are endangered how? Because most of them we hear is through vandalism by the people. Why would people vandalize a landscape that they have protected long before the convention was even conceptualized. I mean, we find that landscape there because people already existed alongside it for a very long time. Why would now, after listing, would it become a problem site or a problem in danger? My theory is that there is a clash of ideology of what is heritage and how it needs to be protected that does not comply with African ideals. Hence the reason why we find that most of the sites in danger are in Africa. So the political conceptualization of conventions also had to take into account African ideals of conservation. Otherwise, the African sites are always going to be labeled as in danger, even when they are not in danger. I see a case where people just want to connect to the landscape that they have for a very long time connected with. But because of the protected area model, because of the core zone delimitation that is demanded by World Heritage, people are now finding themselves being disconnected from interacting with this landscape and can maybe at times only retaliate by being aggressive in a poaching way, as we call it, poaching, as we call it, encroachment. We call it, yes, encroachment is another word. Can we find a model that allows people to interact with the landscapes and not necessarily be labeled as encroaching? These are the rules. We need to break the rules of core zones. We need to break the rules of protected area model to make people feel as part and parcel of our conservation models. I am not in any way saying that there are no poachers. There are no people who destroy sites deliberately, but my point is that if those people were destroying sites and the owners felt strongly that they were part and parcel of the site, they will stop those few people who are indeed encroaching, who are indeed vandalizing, who are indeed poaching. But the landscape has been closed off from its owners. So they are no longer even there to police it because they are told by the protected area model, they are told by the core zone model that they don't belong there. And these are things that we have to be looking at sites in danger in Africa with an eye like that. Here I was just giving this example of Africa has low number on the list, but it has high numbers of sites. And this is an example that I gave that most African sites have mixed qualities. And even UNESCO has itself a category for mixed sites. And it should actually be using this more often. I don't know if I can say more often, or they should always, as a precedence, look at the site as mixed, narrow it down to non-mixed later on, not to look at the site as only maybe compliant to the 1972 convention, and only then when queries come, they can look at other conventions. We have to look at sites as mixed because cultural heritage practice by its nature is mixed. It can never only be animals and wilderness and trees and plants and soils without people imprint. The nature-culture dichotomy, I'm not going to talk much about it because this is a very old disciplinary discussion, but I just wanted to show how important disciplinary approach, international approach can be for an African resource or landscape. National parks are without people because the colonial models demanded as such, and those models were based on European concepts of protecting a landscape that were not at all applicable on an African soil. But we also know from our disciplines that there have been huge studies on nature but very limited on cultural heritage. This is how we have to start looking at things differently when we get outside our COVID. Funders like Wenegren are doing a very good job indeed by funding cultural heritage studies, but we need an anthropological studies of culture. We need a majority of our approaches to balance what we see in nature reserves, National Geographic, everywhere you go on television, with cultural heritage, local community values approach. I have said this, that World Heritage calls on dislocate communities within their World Heritage. I don't want to be long. We could take long just discussing this here because it's very easy to accept the model that has been going on and on. But for us to break these rules of participation, we need to start scrutinizing these models that we admire so much. We never see anything wrong with them. I think indigenous communities in Southern Africa have been cited a lot, but nobody really cites the fact that they have been displaced from their cultural heritage landscapes and they need to be connected with them. Not necessarily relocate back, a need to connect ideologies of interaction of the people with the landscape. And one of those is overlaying the 203 Convention on protected areas, or even in World Heritage listed sites. 2003 Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, where by virtue of its composition call for folklore, and once it calls for traditional craftsmanship and folklore, it says it can never be folklore or traditional craftsmanship or oral tradition without the people. So this is why it's a very important convention. But this is why also it has to be applied simultaneously with other conventions. I'm not saying the 2003 convention is the messiah. I'm just giving an example that if we apply conventions at once on a landscape, it makes it easy to bring out all necessary aspects of that landscape to be taken care of. And also because all the aspects are taken care of, the people heritage usually comes out without being neglected. So here I was just trying to show the research solutions, some of which I'm doing myself. This is one of the researches that I tried to do in the Okavango Delta, even though I don't have funding. People in the natural landscape of the Okavango Delta. This is the mighty Okavango Delta in Botswana. And it gets its water from the rain that falls in Angola and then flows across Namibia and finally into Botswana. I think most of our, when we Google the Okavango Delta, you get all those very fancy pictures. You know? This is the Google map. But it's not legible, but I try. Here I was just with just people and a GPS and boat, go through this and just map what people tell me about the landscape, how their ancestors used to do this here, how their ancestors used to do that here, how they have a mythical site in this of an extraordinary woman who was a very big creature who inhabited the landscape. By bringing out these aspects, by bringing out what we call folklore, folklife, by mapping even sites where people said we used to have a camping site here while we are hunting, we are able to show that these landscapes cannot just be nature landscapes. They are also cultural landscapes that carry the value of the people's identities that needs to be taken care of. People environment, very, very important. These are just examples of this research that I do, but although I am not doing it with a lot of consistency due to lack of funding, but I have started, and this, I hope in future I'll be able to do it in much larger scale. When I find money, then I know at least I have teams of researchers that I can fight for when I finally find funding to do the work. And here is just some of my publications on these topics that I discussed. The International Journal of Heritage Studies, Journal of Community Heritage, I have published about gateway communities and cultural identities of people to this mighty landscape. So my view is that cultural landscapes are open museums of people's identities. Sorry, not cultural landscape, the landscapes that we now view as protected nature reserves, they are conflated with the cultural values of people's identities. But because as maybe anthropologists, as folklorists, we are not going out there looking for them, sites such as the Okavango Delta World Heritage Site will be looked at as natural resources. So it's upon us to go and overlay these values that we see as important and make our policymakers aware. Not only our policymakers, but also make the people not to lose hope because they have been relocated from these landscapes, to say to also governments that there are ways also that we can bring people back into the landscape without relocating them back. We can inventory their cultural heritage within these landscapes and then see to it that we assist in them being participants of interpretation of their heritage to the lucrative high-end tourists that I mentioned earlier on in this presentation. We need to be looking at approaches like that when we move forward, rather than just encouraging the nature pristineness of a site. As tourists, we should always be able to ask, but where are the people? So I want to sum up now with what I've been discussing to say that in conclusion, my experience working in protected areas of my country, Botswana, but also the region, is that they need to be made sustainable by bringing in the aspects of the people. And because if we bring people in through their cultural local values and we value them people, then they can use their intangible cultural heritage, their cultural heritage as an asset through which they interact with the international tourist. They do not need to be competing with investors of high-end equipment like aeroplanes, but they can use their cultural values and through interpretations that are very well packaged, through inventories that are encouraged by the ICH Convention, to participate not only in tourism, but in interaction with the landscape so that they become bodyguards of this landscape. Once the identity is rekindled, it is very difficult for poachers, it is very difficult for destroyers to do that because the people automatically become policemen and women of the landscape. But we also have to make sure that through our academic approaches, we are always asking ourselves if our methodologies are not discrediting any identity that should be accounted for. Or we should also always ask if our methodology is bringing in a new cultural value that has been neglected over time because maybe of the scientific approaches that only need evidence that may not necessarily be accounted for by the heritage aspects that are outside its evidence platform. Practitioner approaches, we should be able to invent local cultural values all the time and recognize that, so that when UNESCO comes to list a site, those are already on the platform. Conservation policy implementation, as I said, international conventions come from the UN, and the UN in Africa is very well regarded, but we have to be able to say conservation policy implementation by international conventions accounts for all the aspects of cultural heritage, such that in the end, local cultural values can be viewed as part and parcel of the indicators of sustainable development, therefore enhancing sustainability of the landscapes that we so badly want to come back to post-COVID. I would like to take this time to thank you very much for your attention. I've spoken for some time, and I'm happy for comments, suggestions, extractions. Thanks a lot for the invitation to the organizers once again. I thank you for your attention.
That's basically what I wanted to share in short with this conference. Because it's a keynote, I felt it needed to be broad enough to ignite conversations across the session during the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of SIEF Local Committee 2, thank you for a really fascinating talk. I think there are already a couple of questions and comments, and I'm also aware we have around 5 minutes for this, but I had my own question, which I'm going to be selfish and ask you, first of all, because I really liked your referencing of breaking the rules all the time. And in the end, in a way, the solution is breaking the rules by applying the rules in a different way, by overlaying this intangible heritage convention over the other UNESCO convention. And I just wondered, has that actually happened yet? Are there any examples where that's been actively applied in Africa that you're aware of?
I think we in terms of practical application, no. This is also part of my work with facilitating something like the UNESCO chair at the University of Botswana, because it's easier to push for such. But the discussions are coming up. In discussions, it's agreement, but we still have the Okavango is listed as nature site. The Tsodilo World Heritage Site is also culture site without the natural. So, but the sentiment is building now that we can no longer be basing our approaches to practical conservation on our dichotomies at either the disciplinary or the international policy level. I am hopeful, but also having the platform now of a UNESCO chair, I'm confident that we could even push for projects outside UNESCO that actually show that. And I'm looking forward to collaborations in that regard, especially for people who are who feel strongly about the subject of overlaying cultural heritage in these nature spaces.
Thank you. Pia, I'm going to hand to you now. I see there are some questions popping up possibly. So.
Okay, thank you. There are some warm thanks to you, Susan, from Pirjo Virtanen and Katriina Siivonen. And then there is a question from Gillian Marsh. How can universities increase visibility and presence of indigenous and local people within the academy, especially in teaching and research?
I like that one very much. Question, thank you, because it will allow also me to talk about the advocacy for this UNESCO chair. I have big dreams like that as academics, it's us who should know what a university can do. A conventional university curriculum would never maybe do things the way we want, but part of the reason why I advocated for the UNESCO chair was to be given the leeway to have, even if it's electives, where you can bring practitioners on campus, because we realize that in Africa, I'll keep on saying, the youths are actually disconnected from their rural areas, which carry a lot of heritage. But these youths are also in tertiary education. So as a university, we have the youths, but we can, through what you call initiatives like UNESCO chairs, which calls for policy academia society network, bring practitioners on the ground of the university to share with the youths that are disconnected. But not only that, to show the disconnected youth that you have left something back home, that while you study, you can be able to think about and innovate about, rather than just maybe being in a modern city. I know this is African, it's an African experience, maybe, because maybe in other countries, you may find a university in a rural setting. But for us, most of our universities are in the city where the youth are disconnected. So yes, universities can also push for curriculum. We are working with the UNESCO World Heritage right now to try and do a master's curriculum that can be different in terms of teaching heritage across all the disciplines. We are hoping to have, through the chair, which will take long, of course, apart from the electives, that is a short-term courses that can run across different disciplines, a master's that can be, a student can take across disciplines rather than within a department as we do in our universities. So there are various ways we can do this. But of course, I know it's taxing for any academic to start looking at practitioners. But one of the projects that we're looking at through the UNESCO chair at the University of Botswana is basically that, to bring practitioners on campus and help students make projects, even though they may be short-term projects of marketing basketry, that can be developed further in terms of internationalizing. I mean, not only internationalizing it, but building models in a university campus that then help the rural enterprises. And it can start as a project for students in the marketing department about marketing cultural heritage, such as baskets. But in the end, it opens their minds to what is happening out there about cultural heritage and how they can assist. I hope I have answered you, but it's a long short trial that we are hoping to get into through this UNESCO chair that we sit at the University of Botswana.
Okay, thank you, Susan. There are no more questions currently, and I don't know if we still have time for some more.
Yeah, we're probably kind of on time now, unless anybody wishes to raise their hand and ask something quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, yeah, I would just say thank you again so much, Susan, for this keynote. It's been really enlightening and really, really valuable for us. I think people have really enjoyed it. And we have a break now. So I think the sessions restart at 2:00 East European time. See you all later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.